a best-selling author, in fact. Her book, Death of the Grown-Up, and more recently, American Betrayal, are two really extraordinary insights into the challenges that we're facing as a people, as a culture, as a society. And in particular, I have to tell you that I think the work that she did with this, she's on her way, as in, she's in the building, General? She's on her way, as in right here, momentarily? Momentarily. Excellent. This will be a shorter vamp than it would have been otherwise. But the background to this is that Diana wrote a book entitled, as I mentioned, American Betrayal, about an episode that came to her attention, or a series of events, I should say, that came to her attention after she began mulling the problem that I think all of us have been bemused by. And several of our previous speakers touched on it. Here she is, the lovely Diana West. Come on up. She began wondering, oh, it's okay, you can applaud, go ahead. She began mulling, what is this about, that we can't tell ourselves the truth about this global jihad being animated by what the Islamists call Sharia, this doctrine that the authorities of the faith say is the same thing as Islam. A lot of Muslims don't practice their faith that way, but what's up with this? And of course, since she began studying this, she found a lot of evidence, not least most recently, the Islamic State is not Islamic kind of nonsense. But she teased into the history of this country and discovered that we've done this to ourselves before, for decades, at great cost, in lives, our own and others, in national treasure, our own and others, and not least in terms of the course of history. She wrote an absolutely blindingly beautiful sort of short treatment of this issue in her syndicated column last week called Blinding History. And when we had an opening in the schedule late last week, I turned to her and asked her, actually after we did an hour-long interview on our program, Secure Freedom Radio, which was superb and is airing tonight, as a matter of fact, here in Washington and elsewhere around the country. I asked her to come and speak to us about the insights from the past and how it helps explain the dangerous blinding of history and of our people that is afoot right now. Diana West, welcome.
Thank you very much. And this is a little speech for anyone who's still puzzled as to how it can be that our leaders and pundits keep hammering home the big lie that Islam has nothing to do with jihad, that the religion of conquest is really the religion of peace. And I think that what's important, as Frank mentioned, for us to realize is that this kind of brainwashing is nothing new. And just as today's opinion makers seek to divorce Islam from its impact, for example, brutal conquest, forced conversion, religiously sanctioned sex slavery, beheadings, past opinion makers worked equally hard to divorce communism from its impact. For example, brutal conquest, forced collectivization, concentration camps or gulags, mass murder. And this worked. We know this worked. Unlike Nazism, communism has never been judged guilty or even held responsible for the carnage and suffering it has caused. On the contrary, it remains a source of liberal, statist ideas such as Obamacare. My recent book, American Betrayal, delves deeply into this dangerous double standard. But in short, this double standard not only enables collectivist policies to strangle our remnant republic, but also explains why American college students can find a drink called Leninade, emblazoned with a hammer and sickle, for sale up the road at University of Maryland. It's also why very expensive silk screens of Warhol's Chairman Mao, history's top mass murderer, are sought after items in the homes of the wealthy. There are no such trendy portraits of Hitler, and who would want one? Who would want to swig a bottle of Hitler Pop emblazoned with a swastika? So why Leninade? Not only does the stench of death not follow the communist murder cult, the brand lives. Barring a tsunami of common sense, I'm predicting that Islam, the brand, will remain separate in the public mind from the violence and repression it causes and has caused for more than a millennium. That's certainly the direction that leaders from both political parties have been relentlessly herding us in for over a decade, insisting against all reason, insisting against all sacred Islamic texts, that Islam is peace. Thus, while contending with this cycle of expansionist jihad, a recurrence that should be familiar to us from Islamic history, were it too not subject to whitewash, we must simultaneously withstand a campaign of lies designed to subvert our understanding of how Islam, in fact, has everything to do with beheadings and other violence, both in the Islamic world and now in the West. And why more than a decade of nation-building counterinsurgencies in Afghanistan and Iraq were doomed from the start. And yes, such whitewashing has happened before. 70 years ago, Americans and British and other allies fought against a cruel Nazi totalitarian dictatorship in alliance with an equally cruel communist totalitarian dictatorship. As far as body counts go, our great Soviet ally had already piled up more bodies than Hitler would. To sell this to we, the people, Americans were introduced to Uncle Joe, Stalin. We were told that communism had changed, that Moscow wanted only secure borders. We were told, you might say, communism is peace. Anti-communist books went out of style. Investigations into communist penetration went into mothballs. At the end of World War II, yes, Hitler's 12-year Reich was destroyed, but Stalin's evil empire had engorged fully half of Europe. Communism is peace brainwashed people were stunned. But Americans were told they had won the good war for liberty over tyranny, and we have celebrated ever since. Whitewashing follows whitewashing, so also obscured was the transformation communism wrought here at home, where agents of influence, fellow travelers, and dupes worked to advance Moscow's will, just as Soviet tanks, and agents too, imposed it abroad. The conventional wisdom, however, remains suspended in the amber of the Red Scare of the 1950s, during which anti-communist witch hunters searched for Reds under the bed, all allegedly in vain. Never mind that many hundreds of confirmed American traitors loyal to the Kremlin had infiltrated the federal government and other institutions in previous decades. The important thing, says the conventional wisdom to this day, is not to connect the dots and examine whether these proxies for Stalin influenced the American century. But the facts indicate they did. Just to mention examples rarely taught in school, agents of Stalin's influence inside the Roosevelt administration helped subvert and topple such anti-communist leaders in Europe as Draza Mikhailovich in the Balkans and the Free Polish government in exile, clearing the way for communist regimes. They helped destroy the anti-communist leader Chiang Kai-shek in China, thus aiding the rise of Mao, who, a la Uncle Joe, was introduced to Americans as an agrarian reformer. Mao would kill at least 60 million people and set in motion events that would draw Americans into two disastrous wars in Korea and Vietnam, killing tens of thousands of young American men. I could go on. about how at the end of World War II, Soviet plans for Germany and slave labor reparations were put over, how the UN was fostered by a Soviet agent named Alger Hiss, how the IMF was fostered by another Soviet agent named Harry Dexter White. Much of this still hidden history at least makes clear why our traditions are today a shambles, where cultural relativism comes from, why it's unlikely Congress will ever repeal Obamacare, why our college campuses are outposts of Marx. Society, however, seems to prefer silence. It prefers to burnish the gilded reputation of Franklin Roosevelt, for example, rather than reckon with the fact that he presided over the biggest national security disaster in American history, the massive infiltration of the US government by agents of a foreign power. And today, Islam's prophet Muhammad is exempt from criticism, a key point of Islamic law, just as Joseph Stalin used to be a rule of the communist police state. Islam's history of repression, too, is off limits to strategic planners, just as communism's once was as well. Mustn't offend the Russians went the World War II era mantra against red baiting. Mustn't offend Muslims is the mantra against Islamophobia, so-called today. In this way, these belief systems, both hostile to our constitutional liberties, remain protected by silence. This silence has already cost hundreds, thousands of American lives in our time. It started right after 9/11, as soon as President Bush declared Islam was a religion of peace, officially delinking Islam from specifically Islamic jihad. Official policy to this day absolves Islam of jihad, and most recently absolves Islam of the jihadists known as the Islamic State. This see-no-Islam policy has also been the deeply flawed basis of 13 years of nation-building failure in Iraq and Afghanistan under the sorry banner of counterinsurgency or coin doctrine. Retired Army Colonel Douglas McGregor sums the problem up this way. The entire, quote, "The entire coin strategy is a fraud perpetrated on the American people. The idea that we are going to spend $1 trillion to reshape the culture of the Islamic world is utter nonsense." I maintain it would have been widely seen as utter nonsense had Islam and its law, Islam and jihad, Islam and dhimmitude been under open consideration rather than tightly under wraps. Instead, the last two presidents sent Americans to die for nations whose constitutions, written with American support, enshrine Sharia, Islamic law. What does that mean? Quite simply, Sharia outlaws the liberties we in the West hold sacred: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, equal rights before the law, and more. Such prohibitions themselves are sacred in Islam. Indeed, Islamic liberty, or Sharia, couldn't be more different from our own. It is defined by a slavish devotion to Sharia. This tells us, or should have, that infidel armies, infidel governments were never going to win hearts and minds or trust of Islamic peoples, which is the linchpin of the coin theory, no matter how much our people bribed, bled, or died. This deduction is confirmed by the most recent polling data compiled by Pew. These data tell us that 91%, this came out in 2013, 91% of Iraqis believe Sharia should be the law of the land. That percentage is exceeded by only one country, Afghanistan, where fully 99% agree Sharia should be the law of the land. So what does a US lawmaker or a coin strategist do with data like this? If that lawmaker or that strategist wants to be a mover and shaker in Washington, D.C., he forgets about them. Whatever he does, he doesn't connect any dots. History shows our leaders rarely do, and somehow they still end up on pedestals. Thank you very much.
Dinah, thank you. I think in some ways that is the central insight of this program, and that is that without leadership that has the clarity to understand the threats that we're facing, they're unlikely to be able to devise strategies to counter them or amass and utilize the resources necessary to defeat them.